On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, one of the most infamous symbols of the Cold War, was opened up by East Germany's government. Over the next few days, thousands of East Germans crossed over into West Berlin to reunite with friends and family, or just to explore the western side of the city that they had been forbidden to visit for nearly 3 decades. While some people did get shot for trying to cross over the wall in previous years, that was not the case this time around. Why was the border opened? How did it end without any shots being fired? Why is the fall of the Berlin Wall such a big deal? That's what we're going to examine today. If you find that this topic or my videos in general are educational and entertaining, please take a second to support me by clicking the like button below. It really does help out and is a great way to help support my work. Now let's start. So before we get into how the wall came down, we need to first understand what caused its construction. The origins of the Berlin Wall go back to the end of World War II. As the war in Europe was coming to an end, the victorious Allied powers, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, met at several conferences to discuss plans for post-war Europe. At these meetings, the leaders discussed what should be done with Germany. Specifically, they argued about how Germany would be divided. As it turned out, the main point of contention was Berlin, which sat deep within the Soviet zone of occupation. The Allies agreed that the city of Berlin, much like Germany, would also be divided into 4 zones, with each of the victorious powers administering one zone. Control of the city was split between the French, British, Americans, and Soviets. This meant that there were 4 different zones in Berlin, which made administering the city incredibly complicated. But no one could have predicted just how complicated it would become. The division of Berlin was supposed to be temporary, but political differences between the Western powers and the Soviet Union led to the division of Germany and Berlin becoming permanent. In fact, Germany was divided not only into 4 zones, but 2 separate states. In the West, there was the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and in the East, it's the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. With West Germany aligned more closely with the United States and the Soviet Union having closer ties to East Germany, the 2 German states became proxies in the larger ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. This tension between the eastern and western halves of the country soon spread to the city of Berlin as well, which saw itself divided into East and West Berlin, with the former being a communist state and the latter being a bastion of democracy. From the perspective of the Soviet Union in East Germany, the existence of West Berlin, an enclave of democracy within the German Democratic Republic, was a constant thorn in their side. To prevent people from leaving East Germany and crossing over into West Berlin, the government constructed a barbed wire fence along the border between the 2 zones in 1961. But the fence was not very effective in stemming the flow of people from East to West Berlin. Since it wasn't very high and could easily be climbed over, East Germany began expanding the fence, eventually turning it into a concrete wall adorned with anti-climbing features, such as barbed wire and glass. Spheres embedded in the concrete designed to catch people climbing over the wall. The purpose of the wall was to keep people from leaving East Berlin. However, if people from East Berlin wanted to leave, all they had to do was make it to West Berlin within the Soviet-controlled zone. There were checkpoints throughout the Soviet zone where people had to show their identification papers and obtain permission from guards to pass through. The majority of people who tried to flee East Berlin for West Berlin were ordinary citizens. By the mid-1980s, a full 85% of people who attempted to flee East Berlin were East German citizens, not people from West Germany or even West Berlin. Many of these people left because they didn't like living under communism and wanted to experience the freedoms afforded to West Germans. Others simply wanted better economic opportunities, as jobs and salaries were better in West Berlin. In response to this brain drain, East Germany increased security along the border to prevent people from leaving. As the wall was expanded and made taller, guards were given stricter orders to shoot people attempting to cross over the border. By 1971, over 20 people had been killed trying to cross the wall. And by 1989, when the wall fell, that number had risen to nearly 300 people. So with that in mind, why did East Germany suddenly open the border and allow people to finally cross into West Berlin after all those years? Well, there isn't a single answer, but rather a collection of events that ultimately culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's take a look at the main factors now. One of the first factors to consider is the leadership vacuum in East Germany. For the first part of 1989, East Germany experienced a series of protests sparked by the government's decision to restrict travel to Hungary. These protests quickly grew into calls for greater political reform and the resignation of East Germany's Communist Party leader, Erich Honecker. After months of pressure, the party's Central Committee voted to remove Honecker from power. However, he was replaced by another communist hardliner, Egon Krenz. Krenz was a member of the ruling party since 1946 and had been a key figure in the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. His appointment to lead East Germany gave hope to many that change was coming to the country. But it soon became clear that Krenz was not interested in implementing reforms. He even went as far as ordering police to crack down on protesters. This move proved to be a critical mistake on his part. By keeping a hard line against the protesters, Krenz lost the last vestiges of public support that the Communist Party had in East Germany. But the unrest in East Germany was not an isolated incident. Throughout 1989, communist governments across Eastern Europe were toppled by popular revolts. In Poland, the first largely nonviolent overthrow of a communist government took place with the emergence of Solidarity, a labor union founded in 1980 to protect workers' rights and interests. Solidarity's actions forced the Polish government to introduce limited free market reforms. And by 1989, it had gained so much power that it was able to negotiate with the communist government to implement further reforms. This paved the way for the first partially free elections in Poland since 1927, which resulted in Solidarity candidates winning a majority of the seats. And this success inspired other countries to follow suit. In Hungary, public dissatisfaction with the government grew as the country faced economic stagnation and widespread shortages of basic goods. By 1989, the situation had become so dire that the Hungarian government was forced to seek assistance from the International Monetary Fund. In response to the country's worsening economic conditions and desire for greater political freedom, the Hungarian government began introducing market-oriented reforms. These reforms included the introduction of private property, the legalization of private businesses, and the lifting of restrictions on foreign investment. These reforms were unprecedented in the history of communist states and set the stage for the eventual overthrow of the regime. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution took place after years of growing discontent with the government's policies. The revolution was largely led by students and intellectuals who demanded greater political freedom and an end to the country's communist government. The government responded with a violent crackdown on the protests, but this only served to unite the people against the regime. Eventually, the government was forced to resign, and Czechoslovakia became a democracy. These revolutions showed people in East Germany that it was possible to overthrow a communist regime and bring about democracy. They also showed that the Soviet Union was unwilling to use force to maintain control of its satellite states. In fact, the Soviet Union was in a much weaker position than it had been in previous decades. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the Soviet Union's leader in 1985, introduced reforms known as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost referred to a policy of openness and a relaxation of controls on media and intellectual expression, while perestroika aimed to restructure the Soviet economy. These reforms were intended to revitalize the Soviet Union and make it more competitive with the West. However, they also contributed to the weakening of the Soviet state. By introducing glasnost, Gorbachev allowed for the free flow of information and ideas, which led to a surge in nationalism and calls for independence in the Soviet republics. The introduction of perestroika failed to improve the Soviet economy, which continued to stagnate. These internal challenges facing the Soviet Union, coupled with the revolutions taking place in Eastern Europe, made it clear to the East German government that they needed to change or risk losing control of the country. On November 9, 1989, Krenz announced a relaxation of border controls, believing that it would appease the protesters. However, he was unaware that the government official giving the order had made a mistake. The official was supposed to announce that travel would be restricted only to certain areas, not that it would be completely open. When people heard that they were free to cross the border, thousands headed to the wall to test the new policy. Soon, border guards found themselves in an impossible situation. They were ordered to shoot anyone trying to cross the border, but they could not fire on unarmed protesters. Eventually, The decision was made to allow people to cross the wall, and that's how the Berlin Wall fell. While the fall of the Berlin Wall is often seen as a singular event, it was really the culmination of decades of tension between East and West Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in world politics. When the Berlin Wall crumbled, it didn't just mark the end of a physical divide, it signaled the fall of an entire era. If you found this story powerful, like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Where were you when the wall fell? Or what moment in history you think had a similar global impact? And if you want more videos that reveal how history shifts in a single moment, subscribe to HistoroMystic and hit that bell. There's always more to uncover. Thank you for watching.